Hi, everybody. Before we get started, there's another student in the legal psychology program, a graduate student, who is trying to collect data for her research project as well. And so I want to give you guys the opportunity to participate in this study. This is not for additional extra credit. This would just count towards the 10 points of extra credit that you're allowed to get in this class. This study is worth 1.5 SONA credits, which if you recall, I double to 3 points if you participate in the study. So let me just show you a quick video where she talks about this study. Hold on one second. Sorry, give me 1 second here. Okay, now I'm going to play the video.
Hello, my name is Devin Labat, and I'm here recruiting for my master's thesis, Civil Trial Decisions B. So this study is expected to take 60 to 80 minutes, and you'll get 1.5 SONA credits for participating. All you'll need to do for this study is listen to and read along with a mock civil trial, and then answer some questions about it as if you were on the jury in this case. So to sign up, you can log into SONA and then use your phone to scan the QR code with the little dinosaur in the corner, or you can just search for Civil Trial Decisions B and sign up on SONA. So the great thing about this study is it is fully online, so you can participate whenever you want, wherever you want before the study deadline. When you sign up, you'll sign up for a specific time and date. So for example, if it says January 16th at 6 p.m. all that means is that you have from the time that you signed up until that date and time to participate. You don't have to participate exactly at that time. So if you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at dlabat@fiu.edu.
Okay, so if you are interested in participating in that, please feel free to sign up. At the end of class, I can put that flyer back up if you want to get the details of that study again. And just a reminder, last week, for an additional extra credit opportunity, I allowed you to participate in a study that my graduate student, Laura, was conducting. That was a 2-part study. You did part 1. If you did part 1 last Wednesday, then you would do part 2 today. So she's going to come in about 45 minutes or so and give you instructions on what to do if you participated in part 1 and you wish to participate in part 2 of that study. Okay, so we'll wait for about 45 minutes for that. Just a reminder that next week, assuming that I test negative for COVID, which I'm going to try to take a test the next day or two, assuming I test negative, we're going to go back to in person. Okay, so anticipate being back in person as of Monday. If anything changes, I will email you through Canvas. It's probably a good idea to be consistently checking your Canvas emails regularly throughout the semester in case anything comes up. So if you don't hear from me, then we're going to have class again in person on Monday. Okay, I'll let you know via email if anything changes and we have to do it through Zoom, but assume that we're going to be in person. Yeah, so if you didn't participate in part 1 last Wednesday, you cannot participate in part 2. You can still do the study going forward, but it won't count towards extra credit towards exam 1. So it would count towards your regular extra credit if you didn't do part 1 last week. Okay, let's first start off with a Top Hat quiz. So if you guys can open your Top Hat accounts, we're going to jump right into a quiz. So this should work despite you not being in class. It should work just fine. You should see the questions pop up on your phone or your laptop just like normal. And if you're having a problem with your Top Hat, remember you can always text your responses. So even if you can't get your Top Hat account to open, you can always text your responses to that phone number. So just feel free to do that. The questions have not shown them yet, so hold on 1 second. Okay. Question number 1. People tend to use the availability heuristic, which states that people tend to judge the likelihood of an event based on which of the following? Is it A, how much that event resembles a typical event? B, how easily instances of that event come to mind? C, our prior opinions of and experiences with the event? Or D, an illusory correlation? And if you are texting your responses, you're texting to this phone number in the upper left-hand corner, 315-636-0905. And remember, you're going to text a code every time you text. You're going to text a code. This code is going to be different depending on which question you're being asked. So you're going to, for this question, 0300 plus A, B, C, or D. Okay, and you've got 10 seconds to give me a response. 3, 2, 1. Everyone's responded. Okay. Question 2. Mike and Maria are dating. When Mike gets angry with Maria, Maria attributes it to Mike being a naturally angry person. But when Maria gets angry with Mike, she attributes it to having had a bad day at work. Maria is exhibiting which of the following biases? Is it the fundamental attribution error, the confirmation bias, the actor-observer effect, or the over-justification effect? In the text message, you always put the 4-digit code and your response. The 4-digit code and the letter that corresponds to the answer, if you want to respond that way. And you've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, and I guess I should go over the answers here. Let me back up to the prior question. Oops. Okay, so the first question was, people tend to use the availability heuristic, which states that people tend to judge the likelihood of an event based on, the answer here is how frequently, or how easily, I should say, instances of that event come to mind. That is option B. Hopefully it's what people put, good. So you guys need that one. Okay, and then this bias for question number 2. Well, what's happening here is that, Maria is attributing Mike's anger to his personality, an internal cause, but she's attributing her own anger to an external cause. And that is reflected as the actor-observer bias. That is the correct answer there. People often get the actor-observer effect and the fundamental attribution error mixed up. Remember, I mentioned this last class, I'll mention it again. The actor-observer effect is that we attribute other people's behavior to the personality, but our own behavior to the situation. The fundamental attribution error doesn't have anything to do with how we attribute our own behavior. It only says that we tend to over-attribute other people's behavior to their personality, but it has nothing to do with attributions for our own behavior. Question 3. You watch a commercial of LeBron James endorsing a new basketball sneaker. Although you know that James was paid to endorse the sneakers and didn't even write the endorsement himself, you still think that he really likes the new sneakers. This illustrates which of the following biases. Confirmation bias, fundamental attribution error, actor observer effect, or overjustification effect. And you've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so the correct answer here is B, the fundamental attribution error. Ooh, okay, not so great on this one. So here's the idea, okay? We see LeBron James say how much he loves a sneaker, and we have to make an attribution for his behavior. Why is he claiming that he loves the sneaker? Well, according to the fundamental attribution error, we attribute his behavior to his personality or something internal to him, that he really likes the new sneakers. And we ignore how the situation might have led to that behavior. In this case, the situation is that he's being paid to say that, right? So we could attribute his behavior to the fact that he's being paid to say how much he likes these sneakers, but because of the fundamental attribution error, we tend to ignore how the situation might cause behavior, and we attribute his behavior to his personality or something internal to him, such as liking the new sneakers. That's why it is the fundamental attribution error. According to the overjustification effect, people will tend to lose intrinsic motivation for a behavior if what? A, they start to get paid for the behavior. B, they receive a surprise gift for the behavior. C, they stop getting paid for the behavior. Or D, they see someone else receive a surprise gift for the behavior. We got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. And Nichols, I don't know why you can't see the screen, but if you can see my screen, that's all you need to respond, because you can always text your responses. Okay, this one's a little bit tricky. Okay, well, we'll have to deal with that, Nicholas, later on, because I don't know what the issue is with your screen at the moment. But we can deal with it at the end of class. This one's a little bit tricky. So, okay, maybe it's not so tricky. People did pretty well here. So it is true. According to the overjustification effect, people will lose intrinsic motivation for behavior if they start to get paid for that behavior. So what happens, of course, is that if you start to get paid for a behavior, you start attributing the reason why you're engaged in that behavior to that payment, to the extrinsic motivation. And you start to think that you're only doing it for the money, so it causes you to lose intrinsic motivation. I thought it was going to be tricky because usually a lot of people say option C, that people lose intrinsic motivation if they stop getting paid for the behavior. But that's not true. It's as soon as they start to get paid for the behavior that it undermines their intrinsic motivation. So yeah, apparently I explained this better than I thought I did. Okay, if you recall in the original overjustification studies that I mentioned last class, people who got a surprise gift for the behavior, like the kids who were playing with markers and they received a surprise gift, a surprise award, they didn't demonstrate the overjustification effect, because if they really got a surprise gift, then they knew they weren't just playing with the markers for the gift because they didn't know they were getting a gift. It was a surprise, right? So the overjustification effect only occurs when you can reasonably come to the conclusion that the only reason you were engaged in that behavior is for some sort of external motivation, like being paid. All right, question 5. Which of the following is not a general theme that can be extracted from the findings we've discussed in social psychology so far? A, people's fundamental motivation is to obtain accurate information about themselves and others. B, people are often not aware of the causes of their behaviors or decisions. C, people do not like to think very much and will often use mental shortcuts to make various decisions. Or D, people are highly motivated to see themselves in a positive light. You got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so 3 of these themes we've talked about in class. We talked about the fact that people are often unaware of the causes of their behaviors or decisions. When we looked at the limits of introspection, we saw that. We saw that people don't like to think very much, and so we often rely on heuristics. It's often why we engage in the fundamental attribution error as well. And we've seen that people are highly motivated to see themselves in a positive light and will distort information in order to maintain those beliefs. But A, we have not talked about, or at least not much. It's not a fundamental theme, that people's fundamental motivation is to obtain accurate information. That tends not to be true. Under the right circumstances, we can be motivated to find accurate information, but generally we want self-enhancing information that makes us feel good. As a consequence, A is not necessarily a fundamental motivation that we've discussed in class. We have, I'm not quite sure why people are responding C. We have talked at some length about how we don't like to think very much. I mentioned that that's a fundamental theme that's going to pop up again in this course. And we often rely on heuristics and mental shortcuts in order to make decisions so that we don't have to think very much. Okay, but as you know, I'm not grading these based on the correctness. I'm only grading them based on whether you responded. So let's start into a new lecture on a new topic. We're going to talk about, over the course of today's class, attitudes. And in social psychology, the concept of attitudes and the studying of attitudes is one of the most important concepts and has been considered to be one of the most important concepts. Because one of the fundamental goals, if you recall from like the first class, it's that social psychologists have is to be able to predict behavior. And the most easily, or one of the easiest ways we have of predicting behavior, at least theoretically, is if we know someone's attitudes. So if you want to buy, or if you want to predict, for instance, if someone's going to buy Coke or Pepsi when they go to the store, how would you do that? Well, you measure their attitudes towards Coke or Pepsi, and presumably their attitudes should predict their behavior, right? If they really like Pepsi and don't like Coke, they should be more likely to buy Pepsi, you would imagine. And so if our goal is to predict behavior, then we really need to understand people's attitudes as a way of predicting their behavior. As we are going to see, though, things are not necessarily as straightforward as that might first imply. And yes, I can allow you to see the Top Hat quiz questions to review them. If you remind me to do that sometime before the exam, at least, I can make those visible. There have been a whole number of different definitions that social psychologists have used for attitudes. There's like dozens of different definitions they've used. But here's one of the more common ones, which is that it's a predisposition to respond favorably or unfavorably to some object or idea. And there's a couple of key concepts within this definition. First off, an attitude is valenced, meaning that it can be positive or negative. There's sort of an emotional concept to it. That's either a favorable or unfavorable concept, right? And so we like things or we dislike things. Secondly, we're defining attitudes here as a predisposition to respond favorably or unfavorably. So it's more than just an emotional reaction. It's more than just you liking or disliking something, because we're talking about how it's a predisposition to respond. In other words, your behavior should change along with your attitudes as well. At least that's the fundamental idea. We're going to see later on that that's not always the case. But typically, if you have a more positive attitude towards something, you'd expect your behavior would follow along with that positive attitude you have towards that thing. Now, attitudes can be either what are known as explicit or implicit. An explicit attitude is an attitude that you're aware of. So if you know that you prefer Pepsi to Coke, then you have an explicit favorable attitude towards Pepsi. An implicit attitude, on the other hand, is an attitude you're not even aware of having. We're not going to talk much about implicit attitudes now, although we are going to come back to talking about them later on when we talk about things like stereotypes, because we're going to see that we all tend to have implicit attitudes towards different types of people, which can lead us to behave differently towards those people. But we're going to put those aside for now. So for today's lecture, we're going to focus just on explicit attitudes, the attitudes that we're aware of having. And just like in the section on the self, we broke the self down into the ABCs, right? The affective component, the behavioral component, and the cognitive component of the self. And we could do the same thing when we're talking about attitudes as well. We can break it down into the ABCs. So what I mean by this is that if you think about an attitude you have, let's say towards, I'll use the example I've been using, if you really like Pepsi, for instance, the affective component of an attitude refers to the emotional reactions that you have when you think about Pepsi. Like, do you like it or do you dislike it? This is the parts, the component of attitudes we're sort of most familiar with. It's what we think of when we think of attitudes, that sort of emotional experience you have towards something, whether you like or dislike something. But a lot of social psychologists believe that an attitude is composed of more than just that affective component. It's composed of an affective, behavioral, and a cognitive component. What that means is that, remember in that definition I just showed you of attitudes, we said it's predisposition to respond, meaning your behavior is going to track your attitudes, presumably. And that's what the behavioral component of an attitude is. Meaning if you have a positive attitude towards Pepsi, not only do you like Pepsi, but it means you're more likely to buy it or to drink it. And C refers to the cognitive component of an attitude. And the cognitive component just refers to the beliefs you have about that attitude object. So the beliefs you have regarding why you like Pepsi, why you prefer it to Coke, because it's sweeter or because of the carbonation or because of whatever, for whatever reasons you have for liking Pepsi over Coke, those beliefs form the cognitive component. Now, those beliefs may or may not be the true reasons why you actually like that thing. As we saw before, at the limits of introspection, we often don't know the true reasons why we like something. But as long as you have beliefs about why you like something, that forms the cognitive component of attitudes. So just to give you another example, if you think about like a significant other, someone you're dating, say a dating partner, the affective component might be that you like being around your partner, you like your partner, got a positively valenced attitude. The behavioral component is that you spend a lot of time with your partner. And the cognitive component would be the beliefs you have about why you like your partner. You think that they're warm, caring, funny, whatever, all those traits, right? And so we can see that for a lot of attitudes, maybe most, some would argue all attitudes, we can break them down into these three components. We have an affective, a behavioral, and a cognitive component to these attitudes. However, some researchers have suggested that not all of these components are necessary for an attitude. In other words, we can have two of these components without having a third component, and we still have an attitude towards something. And just to give you an example of what I mean by this, I want to give you guys a hypothetical scenario. And I'm going to ask you your opinions on something, which you can write in the chat. That's fine. Or if you want to raise your hand virtually, I can also monitor that. But you don't need to copy anything down in the next few slides. But I want you to imagine the following scenario. All right, imagine this. Julie and Mark are brother and sister. They're traveling together in France on summer vacation from college. One night, they're staying alone in a cabin near the beach. They decide that it would be interesting and fun if they tried making love. At the very least, it would be a new experience for each of them. Julie's already taking birth control pills, but Mark uses a condom too, just to be safe. They both enjoy it, but they decide not to do it again. They keep that night as a special secret, which makes them feel even closer to each other. And so my question to you, and I'll look for responses if you want to put a response in chat, is what is your opinion on this? Is it okay for Julie and Mark, brother and sister, to have slept together? So just give me your gut opinion. Okay, overwhelming no's so far. Do I have anyone that wants to say yes? No, all sorts of no's. Okay, so let me ask you a question then. For anyone who says no, why? Why is it not okay that they did this? Yeah, you're saying incest, but I'm just going to ask the question, what's wrong with incest in this case? I mean, obviously, we're talking specifically about two consenting adults. Okay, so they're siblings, right? But why is that wrong if two siblings live together? Okay, so can lead to children with disabilities, right? Okay, well, that makes sense because we know that can be the case. If you share a lot of genetic material, that can lead to a lot of children with disabilities. So it's a good thing Julie is taking birth control pills and Mark uses the condom too. So we don't have to worry about that. So if the real reason why you're against the scenario is that they might have children with disabilities, well, that's not an issue. So you should be okay with this scenario then, right? So are you okay with it? For anyone who said that it's because they might have offspring with disabilities, you should be okay with this then, right? Okay, so let's see. Someone said it could mess up the family dynamic, right? Okay, that's true, but they're keeping that night as a secret and they feel closer to each other. So they've actually bonded as brother and sister. So there's no negative family dynamic. So that can't be the reason why you're against it, right? So again, why are you against it in this case? Unwritten rule. Yeah, for you, it might be an unwritten rule, but for them, they're okay with it. So people are saying morally it's wrong. Okay, but why? Why is it morally wrong? I mean, no one seems to have been hurt in this scenario, right? So how can something be immoral if no one's hurt? Yeah, they might want to do it again naturally, but they actually decide not to do it again. From the scenario, they decide not to do it again. So you don't have to worry about that. So that's not a reason to be against it. So, oh, I have a couple people now thinking maybe it's okay. It's weird, sure. It's weird. I'll grant you it's weird. But is it morally wrong or is it morally acceptable? Okay, so you might say, well, there might be a religious rule that says you can't do it. But if they're not religious, then what does it matter? There is no rule they have to follow if they're not religious, right? So again, this should be okay for them. Okay, so I think what's happening for most people here is that you still feel like it's wrong, right? There still is this gut level feeling at which this seems to be inappropriate, but it's really hard to come up with reasons why, right? I mean, the most common reasons people come up with in this sort of scenario is they're going to have offspring with disabilities, or it's going to push them farther apart, or it's going to mess up the family dynamic, or people are going to think less of them. But none of those reasons actually apply in this specific scenario, right? And yet, despite that, you still feel like it's wrong. What this is demonstrating is a couple things. First off, one of the things I think it demonstrates is that when you've come across an issue like this, your natural inclination is to feel that it's right or wrong, and then only after the fact come up with reasons why you think it's right or wrong. But the problem is you can't really come up with those reasons in this case, right? The reasons don't really apply in this case, but you still feel it's wrong. And so the second thing it demonstrates is that we can have an attitude towards something, like you have a negative attitude towards this situation, without having the cognitive reasons there to support that attitude. So you don't necessarily have to have the cognitive component of attitudes. In general, we tend to think, I think, that we have reasons which lead us to conclude that something's right or wrong, right? What I think a scenario like this demonstrates is the exact opposite, as I alluded to a second ago, is that we often just have a gut feeling as to whether something's right or wrong, and only after the fact come up with reasons to try to justify our initial gut feeling. In fact, let's take a look at another scenario. A family's dog was killed by a car in front of their house. They had heard that dog meat was delicious, so they cut up the dog's body and cooked it and ate it for dinner. So what do you think about that? Was it okay for them to eat their dog? Okay, lots of no's again. But again, you know what's going to happen. If you say no, I'm going to ask you why. Why is that not okay? Okay, so they're saying it's kind of a family member. Yeah, I agree, but the dog's already dead. Like they didn't kill the dog in order to eat it, right? It was killed accidentally. They weren't planning on killing it and eating it. But now, given that it's already killed, what's the difference? So a lot of people are coming up with cultural things, like certainly what we eat is largely a product of the culture that we've grown up in. There's an emotional attachment to the dog. Yeah, that might be the case for most people. Apparently that did not dissuade these people from cooking their dog. Now, I'm not saying, of course, whether it's okay for you to eat your dog, you probably wouldn't, I'm sure, but whether you think it's okay for them in this specific scenario to eat their dog. And people might say they have emotional attachments to animals, right? But I mean, so farmers grow up on farms and they have cows for years and they might slaughter a cow. Can you not have an emotional attachment to a cow? And if so, I mean, is it wrong to eat a cow in that case? Okay, there's certainly societal norms, but just because something's a societal norm doesn't in and of itself mean that it's morally right or morally wrong. It's like eating roadkill, sure. But I mean, as long as they cook it properly and it's not, hasn't been dead for too long, they cook it properly, they can get rid of all bacteria, things like that. In any case, I bring these two scenarios up because they both show the same thing, right? Because again, we have a scenario where you have an emotional reaction to it. And the vast majority of people have this emotional reaction. This is a bad thing to do. But again, it kind of struggle. If you're like most people, you kind of struggle with a good justification for why it's immoral, despite the fact that you have that feeling. Because you might say, well, you have an emotional attachment, but if they didn't have an emotional attachment apparently, or if they did, they were still able to eat it. And again, you can have an emotional attachment to a cow that you slaughter, but we never have to worry about whether we should be eating hamburgers, right? Or people might say, well, it's unhealthy if it's roadkill, but as long as they cook it properly, they can cook it in a way that makes it not unhealthy. So again, we sort of struggle to come up with a logical justification for why this seems immoral to us, which again, I think is showing that we can have these emotional reactions without having the cognitions necessarily that underlie, that support those emotional reactions. Okay, so how do we go about, as social psychologists, how do we go about actually measuring attitudes? Well, the most common way is through self-report. And this is very basic. You can simply ask people their attitudes and the strength of their attitudes by giving them, say, a 1 to 7 scale from very strongly against to very strongly for, something along those lines. That's pretty obvious. That's the most common way, of course, that we have of measuring attitudes. And as long as those attitudes are explicit attitudes, in other words, the attitudes that people are aware of having, that tends to be fine, right, as a method of collecting attitudes. We have seen, though, that there are problems with introspection. We've seen that there are problems with that people might know their attitudes, but not necessarily the reasons behind them. So getting self-report and asking people explicitly to report their attitudes is useful, but there are some limitations to it because of the problems associated with introspection. And partly for that reason, psychologists have explored some other mechanisms of measuring attitudes. For instance, they have used, they tried to look at people's physiological responses, how their body changes in response to thinking about something or seeing an image. So you can show people slides of things and then measure various physiological responses. So people have tried this with EMGs, electromyographs, where you hook little electrodes up to muscles on your face. And if you come across something, for instance, that's very disgusting, we tend to make facial expressions that reflect that underlying feeling we have. And that electromyograph can pick up on those facial expressions by the way that your muscles contort. And they can therefore, figure out your attitudes more or less. or people have tried electroencephalographs, which are EEGs. You don't need to know these terms, by the way, for example. But the EEGs, you measure brain activity, and depending on a pattern of brain activity, that certain patterns are associated with certain emotions. But those are very limited. So typically, these sorts of measures can tell if people are having a positive or a negative reaction, but they're kind of unable to really get at fine-tuned differences between specific emotions. So in a general sense, you can often tell if people are, happy or not with something, but it's hard to break down beyond that. So there's sort of a limited utility for that reason. You don't see that too much in the literature. There are also covert measures, meaning these are measures that psychologists have developed that measure people's attitudes in a way where the people don't even know their attitudes are being measured. And the most common covert measure used in social psychology probably is known as the implicit association test. I am not going to talk about the implicit association test now, because later on in the course, I'm going to have you all take an implicit association test so you can see exactly how it works and how it purports to measure attitudes. So we're going to postpone that to later on in the stereotyping section when we look at that. Just know for now that most of the time, we mostly rely on self-report. So how do we form attitudes in the first place? And there are a number of ways that people can form attitudes towards things. First off, we can form attitudes through some basic learning processes. And there are a number of mechanisms through which we can learn attitudes. And you might be familiar with some of these from an intro psych class or a behavior analysis class or something along those lines. But in case you're not, I'll go through them regardless. One learning mechanism that we can learn attitudes through is through a process known as classical conditioning. And the idea behind classical conditioning is that if you take some sort of stimulus that normally does not evoke any sort of reaction on your part, and you continually pair that stimulus with something else that does evoke a reaction, an emotional reaction on your part, then that initially neutral object can itself start to evoke that emotional reaction. And this is all very abstract. So let me explain this with a more concrete example. This is a famous example that I'm sure many of you have heard before. In this example, this researcher wanted to test the idea that you could get people to learn certain emotional reactions. Okay, and so there's a famous study with this baby whose name is little Albert. This is little Albert in the picture here. And what the researchers did is they first exposed little Albert to this white rat. I know there's a bunny in this picture. I'll get to that in a second. But they exposed him to a white rat. And initially, Albert kind of liked the rat and he'd reach out to pet it and things like that. So he didn't have any sort of negative reaction to this rat. But what the researchers would do is that every time he would reach out for that white rat, the researcher would stand behind little Albert and he took this little hammer and this metal rod and he hit the rod with the hammer, which created this really loud noise, which would cause little Albert to startle. So every time he reached for the rat, the noise would go off, right? Well, you can imagine that what's going to happen over time is that little Albert learns to associate the rat with that really annoying noise, that scary noise that goes off. So eventually, as soon as little Albert sees the white rat, he's anticipating effectively the scary noise. So he starts to cry when he's shown that rat. So what's happened is that little Albert has learned to develop a negative attitude towards that rat because that rat, which is a stimulus, was repeatedly paired with another stimulus, the really loud, scary noise. And as a consequence, he learned to associate the rat with that scary noise. We developed that negative reaction towards it. In fact, little Albert also would cry at anything that was kind of fuzzy. So that's why he's crying when they put a rabbit in his lap. So even though he had not associated specifically a rabbit with the scary noise, what he had done is that because the rat itself was kind of fuzzy, he associated anything fuzzy with being scared. So he got scared of anything fuzzy, including like a Santa mask and things like that. So that's one way that we can learn attitudes through this sort of classically conditioned reaction. Yeah, it is sort of traumatizing, and it's kind of sad that I believe, if I recall correctly, they did not undo this learned reaction. And I think they lost track of him, I believe. I don't think they know what ended up happening to him. So we're not quite sure if he just had that fear, that phobia for life. It's possible he did. But that's not the only way that we can learn to develop attitudes. There's other ways as well. So we can learn through a process known as operant conditioning. And operant conditioning occurs when we are either rewarded or punished for expressing a certain attitude. So for instance, if in this class, every time that you raised your hand to ask a question, I gave you $5, right? What's going to happen is that everyone's going to raise their hands all the time and ask me questions constantly, right? So what's happening is that being rewarded for a behavior increases your likelihood of performing that behavior, which makes sense. And conversely, if every time you raised your hand to ask a question, I gave you an electric shock, you would learn not to ever raise your hand, right? So in the same way, being punished for behavior reduces the likelihood of performing that behavior in the future. And the same idea holds for attitudes. So you can imagine that if you have a child who expresses an attitude that the child's parents like, okay, and the parents reward the child for that attitude, they praise the child for expressing that attitude, the child's going to learn to express that attitude a lot, right? And conversely, if a child is punished by their parents for expressing a certain attitude that they don't like, the child's going to learn not to express that attitude. And so over time, we can come to effectively internalize those attitudes, right? So we can learn attitudes by having been rewarded or punished for them in the past. And I see there's lots of questions going on here. I'm not going to have time to answer all of them. It's a good question. What about the overjustification effect? Because you're effectively being rewarded, right? You're not being rewarded for an attitude per se, you're being rewarded for a behavior. And so what the overjustification effect is, remember, is that as long as you're continually rewarded for some behavior, that'll increase your likelihood of performing it. But the overjustification effect has to do with when you take that reward away all of a sudden. When you take it away, suddenly people don't want to perform it at all because they think they're only doing it for the reward. So this is not actually in conflict with the overjustification effect. Operant conditioning is saying, as long as you keep rewarding people, that'll increase your likelihood of performing it. But as soon as you take it away, that's when the overjustification effect kicks in. A third way of learning about or developing attitudes through a learning process is through something known as observational learning. And this is a pretty easy concept to understand. It simply says that even if you yourself are not being rewarded or punished for expressing some attitude, or you're not being rewarded or punished for some behavior, we can learn to behave in a certain way simply by watching someone else engage in that behavior. Okay, so we learn by watching others, in other words. Now, this seems sort of obvious maybe now, but there was a time where in psychology where it was believed that basically everything, all of our behaviors were a function of what we learned, how we were rewarded or punished directly. And they may not have considered this idea that we can learn by watching others. But we're going to see that when we talk about aggression in particular, that observational learning is quite important, that we can learn to behave aggressively simply by watching other people behave aggressively as well. So we'll come back to this idea later on in the course as well. Okay, so here are three mechanisms we have through which we might learn to develop certain attitudes. But learning is not the only way we can develop attitudes. We can develop them other ways as well. So we've seen the concept of social comparison before in this class, that we learn about ourselves by comparing ourselves with other people. I mentioned that's a really important theoretical idea in social psychology because it pops up in a lot of different places. And another place that pops up is how we develop attitudes as well. So I want to describe to you a famous study that looked at this, the Bennington College study. And this study was done like getting close to 100 years ago, maybe about 85 years ago, somewhere in there. And it was done at Bennington College, which was an all-women's college at the time. Okay. And what the researchers wanted to know is whether the women who went to this college developed different attitudes because they were surrounding themselves with different people at college than they were back at home. So here's what they did. This was a private college, and so the people that could afford to send their daughters to this college tended to be relatively wealthy, okay? And as we know, there's an association between wealth and voting Republican. So what that means is that these daughters had mostly, by and large, grown up in mostly Republican families and Republican households, and they've developed these Republican attitudes. But Bennington College itself, the faculty there, the upperclassmen, tended to be much more Democratic than Republican. And so the researchers wanted to know whether by changing people's social comparison groups, the people with whom these women were comparing themselves, that would also change their attitudes. And so they looked at the percentage of women who voted for the Republican in the presidential election, Alf Landon, as a function of what year they were in Bennington College. So what they showed first off is that the majority of freshmen voted for the Republican. And again, this is partly a reflection of the fact that the majority of these women came from Republican households where they had learned to develop Republican attitudes. But when you look at sophomores, that number drops off to only 43%. And when you look at juniors and seniors, that number drops off really significantly to only 15% of people who are voting Republican. The idea being that when these women are now being exposed to other Democrats, basically, in terms of faculty and upperclassmen, that changes their social comparison targets and that changes their attitudes as a consequence. And so these researchers followed up with these women over the course of their lifetimes, I believe. And these democratic attitudes that a lot of the women developed at Bennington College, they tended to last over the course of their lifetime. These women also tended to, for instance, marry democratic men. So we can also learn to develop attitudes through this social comparison process. There are also significant genetic factors that lead us to develop certain attitudes. And we know this through, among other things, twin studies. This is where either identical twins or fraternal twins are separated at birth and go and live in different families, and so never even meet each other. Now, the difference between an identical twin and a fraternal twin is that identical twins share all of their DNA. That occurs when a fertilized egg splits, okay? So they basically share all of their DNA. But a fraternal twins, that happens when two different eggs are fertilized. So they're no more similar genetically than any two siblings. So what happens is that researchers, if they give questionnaires to sets of identical twins or sets of fraternal twins who are separated at birth, and they compare them to see how close they are, how much they match, what they find is that identical twins are extremely similar to one another. Even though they've never met each other, even though they didn't grow up in the same household, they're much more similar to each other than fraternal twins are, who are separated at birth as well. And the only real reason we have for why identical twins are more similar than fraternal twins if they were separated at birth is due to the fact that they share more of their genes. So that suggests that a lot of these attitudes that we look at have this genetic component. Now, that requires a little bit of unpacking, and I just don't have time to do it. But for instance, it's not like you have a gene that leads you to be Republican or Democrat. There's no such gene that does that, right? However, there might be some sort of set of genes that lead you to be more risk-taking or more cautious. And we know that your tendency to be risk-taking or cautious is associated with political ideology. So if you're more risk-taking, you tend to be more likely to be Democrat. If you're more cautious, you tend to be more likely to be Republican. So as a consequence, these sort of higher level attitudes can develop and have this genetic component like your political ideology, even though there's no actual gene for what politics you have, right? But there are genes for things that are associated with those sort of politics. And so when we look at all sorts of different attitudes, what we find is that the majority of them that we've looked at seem to have some sort of genetic basis, which doesn't mean that if you have a gene that automatically leads you to develop a certain attitude. Genes are much, much more complex than that, and genes interact with the environment, et cetera, et cetera. But there does seem to be some sort of genetic component to a lot of the attitudes that we tend to have. So we really develop attitudes through this confluence of learning factors and social comparison and genetic factors that all interplay with one another. This is a little bit controversial for reasons I just don't have time to get into. It's not controversial that there are genetic components to attitudes, I don't think. There is some controversy as to the extent to which these attitudes are genetic and the extent to which they can be modified and that sort of thing. But that's a conversation that's for another class. So what we're going to talk about for next class, and let me just ask, is Laura in class right now? Laura, if you're in class, raise your hand. Oh, perfect. You just got there. Okay. So we're going to save this for, 1 second. We're going to save this for next class. So what I'm going to do is allow Laura to unmute. So Laura, you should be able to talk, right? All right. So yeah. Laura, take it away with part 2 of your study.
Okay. Hey, everybody. It's me from last week. So during class last Wednesday, you guys completed part 1 of Perceptions of Strangers, or at least I really hope you did. So with that said, sometime in the last hour or so, I'm hoping you got the link to part 2, which should have come from Qualtrics. I believe the title of the email is something like Perceptions of Strangers 2, Part 2. If you didn't get the email, it may be because there's a little bit of a lag with Qualtrics sending that out, or if you submitted the survey like after class or last week on Wednesday, like at night or something, you wouldn't have gotten it yet. But if you did the survey at the beginning of class last week, hopefully you've gotten it by now. So today is when we are going to go through Part 2. All you have to do is click on the Qualtrics email or the Qualtrics link, sorry, that's in the email. And it will take you directly to the Part 2 survey. Okay, so I see some people saying they didn't get the email yet. So yeah, it could be because there's a bit of a lag. I would also recommend checking your spam folder because sometimes it accidentally gets filtered there. It should go to whatever email account, that you entered into the Part 1 survey last time. So if it's your FIU email, it should go there. And then if it's not, it may be in the personal email or whatever you use. But just like Part 1, should take you about 20 minutes to complete, so not too bad. Yeah, if you don't get it at any point, like around the time that you completed Part 1 last week, you should get it today around that time. But if you don't, you can send me an email, or like I'll put my email in the chat here so that you can send me an email and let me know, and I'll try to send it manually. Okay, there's like a lot of messages. 1 second. Okay.
What is the study called again, Laura?
Perceptions of Strangers 2, Part 2. That's what it should say, something along those lines in the subject line.
Part 2, right. And of course, you only will have gotten this email today if you participated in Part 1 last week, and if you completed Part 1 by 2:50 last week. Now, we did Part 1 at the beginning of class, so you should have completed it by this time. If you know you completed Part 1 by this time, but you have not gotten that Part 2 email, I believe you can, do you want them to private message you right now, or?
Let me put, hold on 1 second. How do let me put my email in here, or yeah, let's see, okay. Because I can see everybody's messages like to the whole class, but also to me, so it's a little bit confusing, okay.
So if you did get that email, feel free to do Part 2 of the study right now.
Okay. Yeah, and then let me just put, there's my name and my email in case you like did Part 1 last week, but outside of class time and you don't get the Part 2 email right away. You can let me know and I can track your Part 1 response to see which Part 2 link you should get.
And if you did complete Part 1 in the evening, last Wednesday evening, you won't have an email yet, but you will get it tonight. So if that applies to you, make sure to do Part 2 by tomorrow, okay? If you do Part 2 by tomorrow, then you can still get the additional extra credit. So just make sure that you do that by tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna give you till I guess the end of class to do Part 2. If you have any questions, you can see Laura's email. Feel free to contact her. And once you're done Part 2, we're not gonna do anything else in class today. So once you're done Part 2, then you can leave today's lecture and I will see you in class next week. If you did not do Part 1, you can still do this study, and I would still strongly encourage you to do this study. It just means it won't go to the additional exam 1 extra credit, but you can still use it for extra credit in the class. Remember, I can give you up to 10 points of extra credit. You can still count this towards that extra credit. But to get it as the additional extra credit, you have to have it completed, Part 2 completed by tomorrow, which means you can't do Part 1 right now to get that additional extra credit. So you can find Part 1 on Sona, and again, it's called Perceptions of Strangers. Laura?
Yeah, Perceptions of Strangers 2. Let me see if I can just get a direct link and put it in the chat.
And again, we greatly appreciate it. Definitely, if you did Part 1, you definitely want to do Part 2 as well, because you'll get additional bonus points for doing that. And we definitely appreciate it. Again, Laura's dissertation and her ability to graduate in a few months depends on getting enough people to do the study. So she would greatly appreciate this as well.
Let's see, hopefully that worked.
In Part 2, Laura, verify, make sure I'm saying this correctly. In Part 2, they will indicate their name and email address so we know who did Part 2. Is that right?
Yeah, I asked for their Panther ID for sure. I can't remember if I asked for email as well, but you match the Panther ID for part 1 and part 2 so that they know if they get the full credit.
Okay, so as long as you enter your Panther ID in part 2, we'll know that you completed this. There's nothing else that you have to do. So if you complete part 2, then you're excused for today, yes. And Laura and I will hang around for a while if you have any other issues or questions. Yes, if you're done with part 2, then you can leave Zoom. And yes, if you completed the survey at night, last Wednesday evening, you'll be getting that link this evening. So make sure to check for it tonight and do it by tomorrow. And I keep saying that you need to do it by tomorrow because Laura's going to put together a list of everyone who did this extra credit and send it to me to administer extra credit. She's going to do that tomorrow. So you have to have it done by tomorrow in order to get those extra credit points. So just make absolutely sure you do that tonight.